How's it going, guys? I'm Josh, and today we are going to get kicked in the pants with photographic knowledge. That was terrible. It's my last day before moving to New York, so I figured we'd make one last photo tutorial with this weirdly heavenly backdrop. So today we're going to cover panning photography. Now, we're going to start off with a little bit of background information, followed by using all of the manual settings in your camera, and if you're a beginner, no problem, and finally a little bit of Lightroom in the end. So let's get into this. First off, what is panning photography and why do it? Panning photography is a type of motion blur photography in which you use a slow shutter speed, meaning the camera actually takes longer to take the actual picture and you're blurring part of the motion in the photo. Long exposure shots are another type of motion blur, and if you're curious about those, I'll put a link to my tutorial over here and in the description down below. Panning photography is great for three things. If you have a moving subject, you can isolate that subject and make him pop out from the background. By two, making your ugly background look blurred and beautiful, and three, while also making your subject look like he's moving way faster. So if you have a moving subject, you want to take a cool shot, this is sort of the triple whammy. Now that I've made my sales pitch, let's talk about the equipment you're going to need to take these photos. So personally, I like to use my Canon 70D as well as the 24 to 105mm lens, and I'll put a link to all of my camera equipment and reviews on it over here. However, all you need to take these photos is a camera where you can change the shutter speed. So if you have any basic manual settings you can change on your camera, you're good to go. So basic DSLR is totally fine. A lot of digital cameras will work for you. And believe it or not, you can also do this on an iPhone using an app like Camera Plus or Slow Shutter where you can change the manual settings. And this is an example of an iPhone shot I took, so you can get pretty cool results even with an iPhone. Now I'm going to carry on this tutorial focusing particularly on DSLRs, however all these tricks still apply to whatever camera you're going to use. As far as lenses go, you can use just about any lens as long as it's not a telephoto, because things get a little iffy shooting handheld and moving your camera with a telephoto. Really, I recommend a good mid-range zoom, which is why I like my 24 to 105mm. Finally, we're ready to start shooting, so step number one, pick your subject and your location. So you're going to want to shoot something that'll move past you pretty frequently, and I find that bikes are one of the best subjects for this because you can go to a bike trail and find lots of bikes passing you, or to a popular road in the city. Cars also work great, and skateboarders are also a super fun subject. Now this will take a lot of experimentation, so I recommend going to a spot where you'll see a lot of bikes and have a lot of people to practice on, or have a very patient friend who likes riding in circles for an extended period of time. Now for today's example, I'm going to be shooting my friend Sam Vestal skating the handrail. However, all the same applies for bikes and cars. Step two, some preliminary camera settings. First, make sure you're shooting in RAW mode, which means your files will have the most information and give you a lot more editing capabilities later on. And second, turn your camera into shutter priority mode. And on a Canon, this is TV. On a lot of other cameras, I believe it's S mode. What shutter priority mode does is you set the shutter speed, which is how long the camera will take to actually capture the picture, and then everything else, the ISO and the aperture, are automatically set. Now you can also do this in full manual mode, and that's usually how I would shoot this, but shutter priority mode is a great way to start off, and eventually, if you're feeling more comfortable with ISO and aperture, you can move on to full manual. Step number three, we're now going to set our shutter speed, which is the most important part of this photo tutorial because it's going to affect how much blur you're actually getting with your background. So just to be clear, this technique involves moving your camera with your subject so that the subject stays in focus while the background is sort of dragged out a little bit, and that's what I refer to as blur. So the slower the shutter speed, or the longer your camera actually takes to shoot the photo, the more blur you're going to get. Now I like to say there are two types of blur you can achieve. The first is contextual blur, where you have not too slow of a shutter speed, where you only blur the background a little bit and can still understand what's happening in the background. It just provides a little more emphasis on the subject. And the second I call the conceptual blur, where you have such a dragged out background that you can barely tell what it is anymore, and it really puts emphasis on the subject and also kind of makes it look like an abstract piece because you don't know where the subject is almost. Now the only difference is just how slow of a shutter speed you're shooting with. So now for some base shutter speeds to use. If you're shooting skateboarding, try starting at 1/10 of a second. I found this to be the sweet spot. For bikes, 1/30th of a second, and for cars, 1/60th of a second. Now you should know that there are a number of variables that affect the amount of blur you're going to get, and that's how far zoomed in you are with your camera, and how fast the subject is moving, in addition to your actual shutter speed. So these are just shutter speeds to start off with, and we're gonna move and experiment from there. And a little note, if you're shooting skateboarding, I recommend something where the skateboarder is staying pretty still. So a grind where they're staying in the same position, or a push works really well. A tray flip will be a little bit harder to shoot. Step number 4, focusing. If you have a good fast focusing lens like the 24-105, I recommend just leaving autofocus on because your subject will be at a number of different distances. If you don't have a fast focusing lens, I got you in the next step. Step number 5 is positioning. So you're gonna have the best results when your subject is moving perpendicular to you. And what I mean by that is find the line that your subject is moving in, whether it be a bike path or a handrail, like so, and position yourself so that you are facing it head on. Now, there's going to be an intersection point where you are facing intersects with the line they're moving in, and that is going to be the focal point at which you're going to get the best shot. So back to shooting manual focus, that intersection is going to be the best spot to focus on. Step number 6, we are finally ready to start shooting. So what I like to do is keep my subject in the center of my frame, and using my viewfinder, I just follow them along, shooting maybe 3 or 4 photos as they pass each time. So now, 2 most important things to remember when you're doing this. First is start actually following the subject before you've even taken your first shot, and a little bit longer after you've taken the last shot, which will ensure that you keep the camera as steady as possible while you're actually taking the pictures. 2, it's all on the hips. You're not actually going to want to move your hand at all because that'll shake the camera. You want to instead rotate around your hips. So here, give you guys the full example. So, looking through the viewfinder, bring our elbows in and rotate around the hips, which will keep you nice and steady. Step number 7, it is now time to experiment as usual. So there are a couple things you want to keep in mind. First of all, this is a huge trial and error process, and it'll take you a little while to get used to this technique. So stick with it and you'll have some success. Second, you're going to want to mess with a bunch of different shutter speeds. So start with my basis and try going a little bit slower, try going a little bit faster, and just mess around with it. And third, if you have a zoom lens, try shooting with your lens fully zoomed in and then also fully zoomed out, and you'll find you get pretty different results on either end. Another fun, different motion blur thing you can do is actually moving with your subject. So I could ride my skateboard behind my subject and have the background moving while he is steady, kind of like this. All kinds of different stuff you can do with this and get crazy. I'm super excited to see what you guys make with this. You can also do stuff like using flashes to freeze your subject while getting that motion blur, or you can freeze your subject with flashes and zoom out to get motion blur. There's all kinds of crazy stuff you can do with flashes, but that is for a later tutorial. And step number 8, we're now going to do a little bit of editing in Lightroom. Now I use Lightroom to edit all of my photos as well as a little bit of Photoshop, and it's my favorite editing software. So if you don't have it, I'll put a link to check it out down below. You can get a 30-day trial to try it out. Now, as far as workflow goes, I think it's always good to have an objective of what you want before you start editing. So my goal here was to make Sam pop as well as emphasize the nice colors of the backdrop. So what I did here is, it is a lot of just trial and error of playing around with the shadows and the highlights just to see what works well for you. So you see, I'm sort of toying around with everything, but a couple really important things you want to do. So first of all, contrast is always a must because it helps your subject pop a little bit more, as well as clarity. So I usually drive those 2 up a little bit. And then I know that I have the bottom is a little bit overexposed, so I want to play with my highlights and my whites a little bit, try and bring those down just a tiny bit. Another really fun thing is temperature. You can choose between having warm tones or cool tones, and that totally changes the vibe of a shot, as well as tint. So we have a lot of green in this photo, so I'm actually going to emphasize the green a little bit by bringing in that direction a bit. And finally, I'm going to actually play with the HSL tab, which is probably my favorite thing in Lightroom because you can edit individual colors. So rather than oversaturating the entire photo, I'm going to play with the luminance and the saturation of 2 different colors, and it's going to be the blues as well as the greens. The blues to mess with the color of his pants, and the greens just to see what I can do with the background and make it a little bit more emphasized, give it some energy. And after a little bit of screwing around, this is what I got. That's a basic rundown on how I'd get this edit going, but a couple things to note. And first of all, you can shoot these photos at any time of day, whether it be high noon when I shot this or much later. You can even shoot these at night or inside. So the editing process is going to be very, very different for everyone, but contrast and clarity are huge, as well as messing around in the HSL to really emphasize your subject and get that nice pop. And step number 9 is post your best shots on Instagram using the hashtag JoshKatzPhotos and tagging me at JoshKatz so my work as a teacher can pay off and I can see all of your awesome work, because that is what is super gratifying to me. And I'll be showing off some of my favorite panning shots that you guys took in next week's tutorial. So be sure to subscribe for more photo tutorials. I'll be doing YouTube full-time this summer, so lots more to come, as well as be sure to follow my Instagram to keep up with all of my photography, new videos, and random life stuff. I got a dog last week, which is kind of cool. And finally, you can check out my website to see more of my photos in super high quality, see all of my entire camera setup reviewed, as well as more photo tutorials, and I also sell prints of my favorite shots. That is a lot of stuff. Wow. Definitely something for everyone. You should go check it out. And finally, last week I did an astrophotography tutorial, or star photography, and I wanted to show you guys some of my favorite star shots you posted with my hashtag. 3 of my favorites, we got one from Chasing Midnight, and he used the trees really nicely to give a nice kind of frame. And we've got Tobias Weinhold, who photographed some sort of teepee, which is nuts. And lastly, we have Sensational Pics, who posted a few, but I really like this one. You guys all killed it, and that is so crazy that I introduced people to star photography. Blows my mind. Anyway, that is all I have to say. Thank you guys so much for watching. Best of luck shooting ridiculously cool pictures. I'll see you eventually. That was reckless.